Chapter 6. Toward an Asian Order, Confrontation or Partnership. The most pervasive characteristic of Asian states is their inherent sense of emergence or post-coloniality. All seek to overcome the legacy of colonial rule and therefore emphasize their national identity. All share the conviction that the world order is now being reshaped following several centuries of forced Western intervention. However, virtually every country has drawn its own distinct lesson from the colonial past. When high-ranking officials of these nations discuss core interests, many appeal to different cultural traditions and idealize an alternative golden age. In 18th and 19th century Europe, the preservation of equilibrium, and by extension the status quo, was viewed as a positive factor. In Asia, nearly every state is oriented toward its own internal dynamic. Convinced that it is developing, such a state is certain that the world must evaluate it based on its merits. Even if no one contests the sovereignty and authority of others, and all express a commitment to non-zero-sum diplomacy, the simultaneous realization of so many national building programs cannot help but inject volatility into the regional order. With the advancement of modern technology, major Asian countries are accumulating vast military arsenals, far more destructive than those possessed by the most powerful European powers of the 19th century, thereby exacerbating the risks of miscalculation. The ordering of Asia, therefore, becomes a paramount task for the global community. The self-awareness of major Asian players and their drive to pursue national interests at the expense of the balance of power have shaped the mechanisms of the current order. The near future will reveal whether a trans-Pacific partnership can provide a peaceful basis for the interaction of many conflicting interests. International order in Asia and China. Among all concepts of world order in Asia, the Chinese one is distinguished by the longest tradition, the clearest formulation, and the greatest distance from Westphalian principles. Additionally, China has undertaken the longest and most complex journey in history, from an ancient civilization to a classical empire, then to a communist regime, and finally to a modern great power. Undoubtedly, this course will have a profound impact on humanity as a whole. From the emergence of the country as a unified political entity in 221 BC until the beginning of the 20th century, China's position at the center of the world order was perceived by local elites as so self-evident that Chinese language lacked a word to denote the phenomenon. It was only historians in retrospect who described the Sinocentric tributary system. According to this traditional concept, China saw itself as the world's only sovereign state, in a sense. Its emperor was perceived as a figure of cosmic proportions, a pivot connecting the human and the divine. His domain was not China, not the territories he directly ruled, but all under heaven, Tianxia, where China stood as the center and hearth of civilization, the middle kingdom, inspiring and leading the rest of humanity. From this perspective, world order reflects a universal hierarchy rather than an equilibrium of competing sovereign states. Every known society is treated as being in a sort of vassal relationship with China, based partly on the proximity of that society's culture to Chinese culture. No one is in a position to claim equality. Monarchies of other lands are not fellow suzerains, but merely diligent pupils, mastering the art of governance and subject to being civilized. Diplomacy is not a process of harmonizing sovereign interests through negotiation, but a set of carefully elaborated ceremonies through which other societies have the opportunity to confirm their assigned place in the global hierarchy. In accordance with this approach, the foreign policy, in modern sense, of classical China fell under the supervision of the Ministry of Rituals, which defined the character of tributary relations, while the Border Ministry handled interactions with nomadic tribes. A Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs appeared only in the mid-19th century, and then out of necessity, when barbarians from the West arrived in the country. Even then, Chinese officials continued to consider their task to be instructing the barbarians in the art of governance. That is, in China, there was not even a hint of Westphalian diplomatic principles. The new ministry bore a telling name, the Office for the Management of the Affairs of All Nations. It followed that China was not conducting interstate diplomacy.
The tributary system and the encounter with the West. The purpose of the tributary system was to instill awe rather than to extract economic benefit or to suppress foreign cultures by military force. China's most imposing architectural achievement, the Great Wall, stretching approximately 5,000 miles, was founded by Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who had just defeated all rivals, ended the Warring States period, and unified China. It is a grand testament to military victory, but also an acknowledgement of inherent weaknesses, the embodiment of a vast power conscious of its own vulnerability. For millennia, China preferred to outmaneuver and entice its adversaries rather than attempt to defeat them by arms. A certain minister of the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD, described the 5 baits with which he proposed to manage the wild Xiongnu tribes on China's northwestern frontier, though militarily, China certainly surpassed the nomads. To give them elaborate clothes and carriages to tempt their eyes, to feed them rich food to tempt their mouths, to entertain them with music and women to tempt their ears, to provide them with lofty buildings and granaries and slaves to tempt their stomachs. And for those who come to pay homage, the emperor shall show them favor, greeting them with a proper reception in his palace, and serving them food and wine himself to tempt their minds. These are the 5 baits. A distinctive feature of China's diplomatic rituals was the kowtow, the act of kneeling and touching one's head to the floor to acknowledge the emperor's greatness. This conscious humiliation, of course, hindered relations with modern Western states. However, the kowtow was considered voluntary. By performing it, the foreign diplomat demonstrated respect for a people who were not so much conquered as revered. The tribute presented to the emperor during such ceremonies was often inferior in value to the gifts the emperor bestowed in return. China traditionally sought to dominate psychologically through its achievements and protocol, yet from time to time it did undertake military campaigns to teach disobedient barbarians a lesson and instill respect. Both these strategic goals and the fundamentally psychological approach to armed conflict were demonstrated recently in the wars with India, 1962, and Vietnam, 1979, and are reflected in the ways China asserts its core interests with other neighbors. Nevertheless, China was not a missionary society in the Western sense of the term. It sought to instill awe, not to convert. This was a subtle line the Chinese never crossed. The focus was on achievements, which other societies were expected to appreciate and revere. It was quite possible for a country to be recognized as a friend, even an intimate one, but it could never become an equal to China. Ironically, the only foreigners who managed to achieve near-equal status were conquerors. History knows several examples of cultural imperialism, and the most striking relate to China. The two peoples who conquered China, the Mongols in the 13th century and the Manchus in the 17th, were forced to adopt the foundations of Chinese culture to facilitate the governance of such a vast population, sincerely convinced of its cultural superiority. The conquerors eventually found themselves largely assimilated by the defeated society, and over time, significant portions of their ancestral lands came to be perceived as inherently Chinese. China showed no intention of exporting its political system, rather it bestowed it upon others. In this sense, it expanded not by conquest, but by spontaneous accretion. In the modern era, Western nations, also confident in their own cultural superiority, attempted to incorporate China into the European world order, upon which the structure of international order was built. They pressured China to establish ties with the outside world through the exchange of embassies and free trade, and forced it to modernize its economy and society, opening the way for Christian proselytism. The West interpreted this movement as a process of enlightenment and engagement, but China viewed such behavior as aggression, attempting first to parry and then moving to direct confrontation.
When the first British envoy, George Macartney, arrived in China in the late 18th century, he brought some early fruits of the Industrial Revolution and a letter from King George III proposing the establishment of free trade and embassies in Beijing and London, respectively. The Chinese boat on which he traveled from Guangzhou to Beijing was decorated with a flag bearing an inscription that translated to "The English Ambassador bringing tribute to the Emperor of China." Macartney was given a reply to the King of England, explaining that no envoy would be permitted to reside in Beijing because, in Europe, there are many countries besides your own. If each and every one demanded the right to be represented at our court, how could we agree? This is truly impossible for practical reasons. The emperor saw no need to increase trade beyond existing volumes under strict regulation because Britain had no goods desired by China. Surveying the wide world, we have but one objective in view, namely to maintain a perfect government and to fulfill the duties of the state. Strange and costly objects do not interest me. If I have commanded that the tribute offerings sent by you, O king, that they should be accepted, this was solely in consideration for the spirit which prompted you to dispatch them from afar. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. After the defeat of Napoleon, Britain, sending trade expeditions worldwide, again attempted to gain a foothold in China and dispatched a second ambassador with a similar proposal. The demonstration of British naval power during the Napoleonic Wars virtually had no impact on China's position regarding the desirability of diplomatic relations. When Ambassador William Amherst refused to perform the ceremonial kowtow on the pretext that his dress uniform had not yet arrived, the British were politely asked to leave, and efforts to smooth over the embarrassment were ignored. The emperor sent a message to the British Prince Regent stating that China, ruling all lands under heaven, could not allow the envoy of every barbarian country to change established protocol. An entry appeared in the Imperial Chronicles stating that a kingdom lying far across the oceans has manifested its submission and yearns for civilization. But, as a 19th-century Western missionary translated the document, henceforth no more envoys should be sent across such a distant route, for this would be a futile waste of time and energy. If the king wishes to incline his heart towards submission, he may send an envoy to our court when there is an invitation. This is the true path to civilization. So that you may obey forever, we have issued this decree.
The collision of worlds from empire to state. Although such statements seem, to put it mildly, presumptuous by today's standards, and were certainly a grave insult to a country that had just secured the European balance and could boast advanced achievements in economics, industry, and naval power, the emperor's response was composed in full accordance with Chinese conceptions of the world. These were conceptions that had prevailed for millennia and had influenced many neighboring peoples. The Western powers, to their shame, ultimately resolved the issue of free trade radically, insisting on their right to import without restriction the most harmful commodity of all, opium. So much for the discourse on progress. Toward the end of the Qing dynasty, China had neglected the advancement of military technology, partly because it had long remained unsurpassed in the region, but primarily due to the low status of the military in the Confucian social hierarchy. This was reflected in the proverb, "Good iron is not used for nails, and good men do not become soldiers." Even amidst the invasion by Western powers, the Qing dynasty in 1893 expended a portion of the military budget on restoring the magnificent marble boat at the imperial summer palace. Yielding temporarily to military pressure, China signed a treaty with Western nations in 1842. However, it continued to assert its uniqueness and fought persistent rearguard actions. Following a decisive victory in the War of 1856 to 1858, provoked by the unjustified seizure of a British vessel in Guangzhou, Great Britain insisted on a treaty securing the long-awaited right to establish an embassy in Beijing. Arriving the following year with a grand retinue to take up his post, the British envoy found the main river route to the Chinese capital blocked by chains and stakes. When a detachment of British Marines attempted to clear the obstacle, the Chinese opened fire.
519 British soldiers were killed and another 456 were wounded. Britain then dispatched an expeditionary force under Lord Elgin, which stormed Beijing and burned the Summer Palace. The emperor and the court fled. The brutality of the British forced the ruling dynasty to reluctantly grant permission for the creation of a legation quarter to house Western diplomatic representatives. China's consent to Westphalian principles of mutual diplomacy among sovereign states was extracted by force of arms. Behind these conflicts lay the central question: is China a world order unto itself, or is it a state like any other, part of an international system? China clung to the traditional definition. As late as 1863, after 2 military defeats by barbarian armies in severe internal unrest, the Taiping Rebellion, which was suppressed only with the involvement of foreign troops, the emperor sent a message to Abraham Lincoln assuring him of China's benevolence. Having received the grace of heaven in the command to rule the universe, we regard the Middle Empire, China, in foreign countries as one family, where there are no distinctions. In 1872, the prominent Scottish sinologist James Ledge clearly articulated the aforementioned question with the characteristic certainty of the era in the self-evident superiority of the Western concept of world order. During the last 40 years, China's position toward the more advanced nations of the world has completely changed. China has concluded treaties with them on equal terms, but I don't think its ministers or its population are ready to face the facts and recognize that China is but one of many independent countries in the world, that the mandate to rule all under heaven, under which the emperor reigns, applies not to the whole world, but to a specific part of the globe, with established borders and marked on a map. The development of technology and trade brought divergent systems closer. Which norms of world order were destined to prevail? In Europe, the Westphalian system was the consequence of the existence of multiple de facto independent states at the end of the 30 Years' War. Asia entered the modern era without possessing such instruments of national and international organization. It consisted of several civilizational centers surrounded by smaller kingdoms, each offering its own elaborate and practiced scheme of interaction. Fertile plains and an unusually resistant to foreign influence, combined with political shrewdness, allowed China to maintain unity for over 2 millennia and exert significant political, economic, and cultural influence on the region, even when the country could not boast military might. China's comparative advantages lay in the success of an economy that produced goods desired by all its neighbors. Formed on these factors, the Chinese idea of world order differed markedly from the European one, which grew out of multiple contacts between sovereign and equal states. The drama of China's collision with the advanced nations of the West and Japan was heightened by the behavior of the great powers, their overt and unbridled expansion, and aggression against a civilization that initially viewed the attributes of modern statehood as forms of humiliation. China's rising to the summits in the 21st century is a restoration of historical patterns. The only difference is that China has returned as both the heir to an ancient civilization and as a modern great power of the Westphalian model. It combines the legacy of Tianxia, the fruits of technocratic modernization, and the results of the turbulent search for national prosperity throughout the 20th century.
China and the world order. From revolution to global power. The imperial authority fell in 1911, and the establishment of the Republic of China, led by Sun Yat-sen in 1912, bestowed upon China a weak central government and ushered in decades of military dictatorship. A firm central authority returned in 1928 under Chiang Kai-shek, who wanted China to take a dignified place within the Westphalian world order and the global economic system. Desiring both to modernize the country and to preserve Chinese traditions, he attempted to integrate China into an international system that was itself undergoing turbulent times. Then, Japan, having embarked on modernization half a century earlier, moved toward Asian hegemony. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 was followed by Japan's invasion of central and eastern China in 1937. The nationalist government failed to consolidate its power, providing the communist movement with a needed respite. Ending World War II among the victor nations, China immediately found itself engulfed in the flames of civil war and revolutionary upheavals that rejected its entire millennia-old heritage. On October 1, 1949, in Beijing, Communist Party leader Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China and added, "The Chinese people have stood up." Mao repeated his slogan, arguing that China needed to cleanse and strengthen itself, adopt the doctrine of continuous revolution, and engage in the dismantling of existing institutions of domestic and international order. Everyone fell under the sights: Western democracies, Soviet communism, and the legacy of China's past. Arts and monuments, holidays and traditions, vocabulary and clothing were repeatedly and ingeniously banned. Art and history were accused of provoking the passivity that had prevented China from preparing for foreign invasions. In Mao's conception, though he spoke of great harmony, citing classical Chinese philosophy, the new China was to shake off the dust of traditional Confucian culture. Every wave of revolutionary energy, Mao argued, would be a stage on the way to the next. The revolution must be accelerated, otherwise revolutionaries would grow lazy and rest on their laurels. Imbalance is the general and objective rule. The cycle, which is infinite, develops from equilibrium to equilibrium, and then to a new disruption of equilibrium. Each cycle, however, leads to a higher level of development. The absence of equilibrium is normal and absolute, while equilibrium is transient and relative. Ultimately, these trials were to produce something akin to a traditional result for China, a form of communism, naturally Chinese, defining itself by a unique code, relying on its achievements, and emphasizing China's unique, now revolutionary moral authority, Tianxia, all under heaven, in a communist guise. International affairs were also made dependent on China's unique character. Although China was objectively weaker by the scale used by the rest of the world to measure strength, Mao insisted on its central role and on a psychological and ideological superiority that was to be demonstrated through confrontation rather than reconciliation with those who possessed superior military might. Speaking in Moscow at an international conference of Communist Party heads in 1957, Mao shocked fellow delegates by declaring that in the event of a nuclear war, China's larger population and resilient culture would make it the victor, and even hundreds of millions of dead would not force China to abandon its revolutionary course. Part of this may have been a bluff, a high-stakes game with holders of vast nuclear arsenals, but Mao certainly wanted the world to believe he did not fear nuclear war. In July 1971, during my secret visit to Beijing, Zhou Enlai confirmed this Maoist concept of world order, quoting the chairman with a smirk, "There is chaos under heaven, the situation is excellent." From chaos, the People's Republic, tempered by decades of struggle, would eventually rise in all its majesty, not only in China, but everywhere. The communist world order, as we see, grows organically out of the classical imperial one. Like the founder of China's first truly powerful dynasty, 221 to 207 BC, Emperor Qin Shi Huang sought to unify China and dreamed of destroying the ancient culture he blamed for the country's weakness and humiliation. He ruled remotely, also like the emperors, though emperors did not speak at mass rallies, and combined Chinese experience with the practices of Lenin and Stalin. Mao's rule epitomizes the revolutionary's dilemma. The more radical the changes the revolutionary calls for, the stronger the resistance, not necessarily from ideological opponents, but from the simple inertia of society. Revolutionary prophets are always tempted by the chance to challenge mortality, accelerate the course of events, and multiply the means of realizing their vision.
In 1958, Mao launched the disastrous Great Leap Forward, intending to achieve dizzying industrialization, and initiated the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to cleanse the ruling elite and prevent its institutionalization. A decade-long ideological campaign sent an entire generation of educated youth to the countryside. Tens of millions perished to achieve Mao's goals, destroyed without love or hatred, mobilized to fit into a single lifetime, events that were previously considered a long historical process.
Revolutionaries win when their achievements are taken for granted and the price paid for them is accepted as a matter of course. Some of China's current leaders suffered heavily during the Cultural Revolution, but they now claim that these sufferings gave them strength, allowed them to know themselves, and taught them how to motivate others to fulfill the tasks of the country's grand transformation. The Chinese public, especially those too young to have experienced Mao's care firsthand, views the chairman primarily as the unifier of China and the man who restored the country's dignity. Which aspect of Mao's legacy will prevail, the bold Maoist challenge to the world or the quiet resolve formed after the excesses, will largely determine China's relationship with the world order of the 21st century. In the early stages of the Cultural Revolution, China chose to maintain only 4 ambassadors worldwide and engaged in confrontation with both nuclear superpowers, the U.S. and the USSR. By the late 1960s, Mao recognized that the Cultural Revolution had exhausted even the millennia-tested capacity of the Chinese people to endure, and that China's isolation could provoke the foreign intervention they had tried to avoid through harsh ideology. In 1969, the Soviet Union was on the brink of war with China, forcing Mao to send all ministries to the provinces. Only Premier Zhu Enlai remained in Beijing. Mao responded to this crisis with a characteristically unexpected change of course. He ended the anarchic side of the Cultural Revolution, used the army to subdue the Red Guard militants, and exiled them to the countryside. Furthermore, Mao checkmated the Soviet Union by pivoting toward the hitherto hated United States. Mao calculated that friendship with the U.S. would end China's isolation and allow other countries to recognize the People's Republic of China. Interestingly, a CIA briefing prepared for my first trip to China stated that Sino-Soviet friction was so great that an American rapprochement with China was possible and desirable, but Mao's convictions would not permit this during the great helmsman's lifetime. Revolutions, regardless of how radical they are, need a consolidation of effort and a gradual adaptation to events that form a steady trend over time. The historical role of reconciler fell to Deng Xiaoping. Twice purged by Mao, it was he who led China after the chairman's death in 1976 and soon began reforming the economy and opening society. Building what he defined as socialism with Chinese characteristics, Deng unleashed the latent forces of the Chinese people. In just one generation, China transformed into the world's second-largest economy. To accelerate these dramatic changes, though not all approved of them, China joined international institutions and accepted the established rules of the world order. Nevertheless, China's participation in the Westphalian structure implies a certain duality stemming from historical experience. China remembers that its initial entry into the international system of states was forced, that it was effectively obliged to recognize an international order contrary to the country's identity in ways that were inconsistent with the generally accepted principles of the Westphalian system. When calls are made to stick to the rules of the game and observe responsibilities, the natural reaction of many Chinese, including top leaders, is largely shaped by the realization that China did not participate in making the rules of this system. China is asked, and, showing prudence, agrees, to follow rules in the development of which it took no part, and the Chinese expect, and sooner or later they will begin to realize these aspirations, that the international system will evolve in a way that allows China to occupy a central place in future norm setting, with the possibility of revising some existing rules.
The United States and China, pillars of a new order. In anticipation of this outcome, Beijing has become far more active on the world stage.
With the status of the Chinese economy as potentially the world's largest, China's cooperation and support are now sought in every international forum. China has participated in many prestigious projects of the 20th and 21st centuries, hosting the Olympic Games, sending its presidents to address the United Nations, and ceremoniously receiving heads of state and government from the world's leading nations. By any measure, China has restored the prestige it possessed for millennia. The question now is how it perceives modern steps toward shaping a world order, specifically, what its relationship with the United States will be. The United States of America and China are the pillars of the world order. It is noteworthy that both countries have historically exhibited an ambivalent attitude toward the international system, yet they have now transformed into its anchors and affirmed their commitment to its principles, even when perceiving certain aspects of this construction critically. China has no experience playing the role it aspires to in the 21st century, the role of a single major state among equals. Similarly, the United States has no experience interacting on a permanent basis with a country of comparable size and similar economic efficiency, but one that professes an entirely different model of internal order. The cultural and political backgrounds of the two countries differ in vital respects. The American approach to politics is pragmatic. China prefers conceptualism. America has never been subjected to threats from powerful neighbors. China has never been left to itself without a potent adversary at its borders. Americans believe that every problem has a solution. The Chinese are convinced that every solution opens the way to a new complex of problems. Americans react to current circumstances. The Chinese concentrate on evolutionary changes. Americans outline an agenda guided by practical, achievable goals. The Chinese postulate general principles and analyze what follows from them. Chinese thinking is formed partly by communism, but increasingly draws upon ancient tradition. Neither is inherent to Americans. China and the U.S. have only recently, from a historical perspective, become full participants in the international system of sovereign states. China considers itself unique and largely exists within its own reality. America also believes itself to be unique, exceptional, yet adheres to a moral obligation to spread its values worldwide, often forgetting the raison d'etat. Two great societies with different cultures and ideologies are undergoing fundamental internal adjustments. The potential rivalry or a new form of partnership between them will shape the prospects of the 21st century world order. China is currently governed by the fifth generation of leaders since the revolution. Each previous leader formulated a distinct vision of China's needs, characteristic of his generation. Mao Zedong was determined to uproot existing institutions, even those he created himself, so they would not become mired in China's bureaucratic legacy. Deng Xiaoping realized that China could not maintain its significance if it remained in international isolation. His efforts had a clear focus, not to boast so that other countries would not become worried, not to demand primacy, but to actively modernize society and the economy. Based on this setting, Jiang Zemin, appointed during the Tiananmen Square conflict, exerted active diplomatic efforts at the international level from 1989 and sought in every way to strengthen the position of the Communist Party within the country. He brought the PRC into the international state and trade systems as a full member of both. Hu Jintao, chosen by Deng, skillfully soothed the international community's fears regarding China's rising influence and laid the foundation for the concept of a new type of relations proclaimed by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping seeks to build upon this rich legacy and has initiated a large-scale reform program comparable to Deng's reforms. He has proposed a system that, while refraining from democracy, will be more transparent and in which outcomes will depend more on legal procedures than on established personal and family relationships. He has also challenged many established social institutions and practices, specifically state-owned enterprises, those fiefdoms of regional officials and centers of corruption. This bold vision will undoubtedly bring the country a number of challenges and uncertainties. The composition of the Chinese leadership reflects China's evolution toward participating in and even shaping global issues. In 1982, not a single member of the Politburo had a higher education. At the time of this book's writing, almost all of them have graduated from institutes, many earning advanced degrees. Higher education in China is based on Western-style curricula rather than the traditions of the Mandarin system, nor on communist syllabi offering their own forward intellectual inbreeding. This is a clear break from China's past, when the Chinese took pride in their patriarchal perception of the world lying outside the Sinocentric sphere. Modern Chinese leaders certainly know their country's history, but they are not its prisoners.
The long-term perspective, the Thucydides Trap. Potential friction between existing and emerging centers of power is not new. An emerging power inevitably encroaches upon certain spheres previously considered the exclusive prerogative of the existing one. Furthermore, this emerging power suspects that its rival may attempt to thwart it before it is too late. A Harvard University study showed that in the history of 15 cases of interaction between an emerging and an existing power, 10 ended in war. Therefore, it is not surprising that strategists on both sides cite behavioral models and historical experience to predict the inevitability of conflict between the two societies. The Chinese interpret many American actions as a desire to obstruct China's rise, and American human rights advocacy is viewed as an attempt to undermine China's domestic political structure. Some prominent figures refer to America's so-called rebalancing policy, the pivot to Asia, as a harbinger of a decisive showdown designed to permanently relegate China to a secondary role. This is all the more notable because at the time of this book's writing, no major redeployments of military units had been carried out or planned. On the American side, there are concerns that a new China will systematically challenge U.S. preeminence and thereby undermine American security. Many view China, by analogy with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, as a state striving for military as well as economic dominance in all nearby regions, and consequently, contemplating hegemony. Both sides reinforce their suspicions through military maneuvers and defense programs, even when these appear normal, that is, consisting of measures any prudent country takes in defense of its national interests. Such maneuvers and programs are analyzed in terms of conflict scenarios. At the same time, each side takes certain steps to ensure that unilateral actions do not escalate into another arms race. Both parties should recall the decade before the First World War, when the gradual accumulation of suspicion and covert confrontations eventually led to catastrophe. The leaders of Europe trapped themselves through their military planning and their unwillingness to separate strategy from tactics. Two other factors also contribute to maintaining tension in Sino-American relations. China rejects the assumption that the international order should be built upon the spread of liberal democracy and that the international community has an obligation to impose this concept, especially the idea of human rights, on everyone. The United States is fully capable of interpreting its views on human rights broadly for the sake of strategic priorities. Given the history and beliefs of its people, America will of course never renounce these principles as such. As for China, the viewpoint of the Chinese elite on this matter was articulated by Deng Xiaoping. In fact, national sovereignty is much more important than human rights, but the G7 or G8 often violates the sovereignty of poor and weak third world countries. Discourses on human rights, freedom, and democracy are intended only to mask the interests of strong and wealthy countries, which use these slogans to intimidate the weak and strive for hegemony by conducting power politics. The path forward: balance and partnership. Between such polarized views, no official compromise is possible. Yet preventing these disagreements from escalating into conflict is one of the most critical tasks for the leaders of both nations. Another pressing factor is North Korea, to which a 19th century aphorism by Bismarck is certainly applicable. We live in a wondrous time in which the strong is weak because of his scrupulous, and the weak grows strong because of his audacity. North Korea recognizes no principles of legitimacy, not even its professed communist ones. Its primary ambition is the creation of several atomic bombs. It lacks the military potential to wage war against the United States, but the possession of nuclear weapons holds a political significance far outweighing its military utility. It incentivizes Japan and South Korea to develop their own nuclear arsenals. It allows Pyongyang to be audacious beyond measure, pushing toward a new war on the Korean Peninsula. For China, North Korea is a serious problem. In the eyes of many Chinese, the Korean War epitomizes China's resolve to end the century of humiliation and stand up on the world stage. It also serves as proof that one should not get embroiled in wars whose causes are indifferent to China and whose results may have fundamental, large-scale, and unpredictable consequences. This is precisely why China and the United States move in parallel and with resolve in the UN Security Council, demanding that North Korea abandon, not merely suspend, its nuclear program.
For Pyongyang, renouncing nuclear weapons could mean political collapse, yet it is the total cessation of these activities that the United States and China insist upon in UN Security Council resolutions. Both countries must coordinate their policies for the eventuality of when these goals being achieved. Can a currently divided Korea be unified, and at what cost? Are China and the U.S. capable of developing a joint strategy regarding a denuclearized, unified Korea, a strategy that ensures common security and stability? This would indeed be a major step toward the new type of relations so often mentioned and so slowly formed. China's new leaders recognize that the reaction of the Chinese population to this vast agenda is unpredictable. They are sailing in uncharted waters. They do not seek foreign adventures, yet they will resolutely resist any attempts at interference in what China defines as its core interests, more firmly than their predecessors, precisely because they feel obligated to explain course adjustments inextricably linked to reforms, with an additional emphasis on national interests. Any international order involving the U.S. and China must provide for a balance of power, but the traditional regulation of this balance should be tempered by an agreement on norms and reinforced by cooperation. The leaders of China and the U.S. publicly voice a mutual desire for contact and constructive dialogue. Two American presidents, Barack Obama and George W. Bush, reached agreements with their Chinese counterparts, Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, on a strategic partnership in the Pacific region. This is a way to maintain the balance of power while simultaneously reducing the degree of military threat. Thus far, unfortunately, declarations of intent have not been backed by concrete steps. Partnership cannot be secured by hollow declarations. No agreement guarantees a specific international status for the U.S. If the United States begins to be perceived as a former power by its own choice, China and other countries will appropriate a significant portion of the authority America held after World War II, following an interlude of crises and upheavals. Many Chinese perceive the U.S. as a superpower in decline. Nevertheless, the prevailing view within the Chinese leadership is that the United States will retain substantial potential for world leadership for the foreseeable future. The essence of a constructive world order is that no single country, neither China nor the U.S., is capable of assuming a leading role similar to that of the United States immediately following the Cold War, when it stood alone at the summit. In East Asia, the U.S. is not so much a balancer as an integral part of the balance of power. Previous chapters have shown the fragility of such a balance in a situation with few participants, where any shift in loyalty can prove decisive. A purely military approach to the equilibrium in East Asia would likely lead to a division even more rigid than the one that took shape during the last World War. In East Asia, a semblance of a balance of power exists among China, Korea, Japan, and the U.S., with Russia and Vietnam on the periphery. But this structure differs from historical balances in that one of its key participants, the United States, has its own center of gravity located near the geographical center of East Asia. Most importantly, the leaders of both nations, whose military forces consider each other adversaries, speak in public statements of cooperation on political and economic issues. It turns out that the U.S. is an ally of Japan while seeking partnership with China. It is very similar to the situation in which Bismarck concluded an ally with Austria to balance a treaty with Russia. Paradoxically, it was precisely such ambiguity that ensured the flexibility of the European equilibrium, and the abandonment of it, in the name of transparency in relations, led to increased confrontation, culminating in a world war. For more than a century, from the open-door policy and Theodore Roosevelt's mediation in ending the Russo-Japanese War, America has made every effort to prevent the emergence of hegemony in Asia by any power. Under modern conditions, Chinese policy inevitably boils down to keeping potentially hostile forces as far as possible from its borders. Both countries maneuver within this space. The preservation of peace depends on the restraint with which they pursue their goals, and their ability not to allow political and diplomatic competition to escalate into military conflict. In the Cold War, the dividing lines lay between military blocs. Today, such lines must under no circumstances be defined by militaristic considerations. The military component cannot be perceived as the sole or even the primary element of equilibrium. The concept of partnership must paradoxically become the basis of a modern balance of power, especially in Asia. This approach, if successfully implemented, would be unprecedented and fateful. The combination of a balance of power strategy and partnership diplomacy will not eliminate all aspects of competition, but it will mitigate their effects. Above all, it will provide Chinese and American leaders with the experience of constructive cooperation and point both societies toward a peaceful future. Order is always a delicate and fragile equilibrium of restraint, power, and legitimacy. In Asia, it must combine the balance of power and the concept of partnership. A purely military definition of the balance is fraught with confrontation. A purely psychological approach to partnership invites fears of hegemony. Wise statesmanship is called upon to find an intermediate balance, for any imbalance promises catastrophe.